and I'm your host on Insight Vietnam. So once a deal is struck and a new entity is formed, do you see any challenges in terms of amendment of licensing or registration of licenses?
But generally, with private equity, it's a change in the shareholders, and so it's just a registration of the new shareholders, and we don't see any difficulties in that part of the transaction normally. But in some cases, again, if you're buying into a privately owned business, the land use rights may still be in the name of the former owner, family business again. So getting land use rights transferred is sometimes more problematic.
When you say problematic, what is the problem? It's impossible to transfer, it's very difficult to transfer, or?
It's just the administrative process that you've got to go through and dealing with the local authorities.
Because you have to deal with different ministers and different ministries, sorry.
Well, generally you're dealing with one department of the Department of Planning and Investment or Natural
Resources.
Department of Natural Resources.
So two different departments. Yeah. So they may not agree with the transfer of land use right, even though your investment license has been approved. Is that the case?
Well, if it's private equity, you're buying into an existing company, so there's no change in the license. It's just a change actually in the shareholders. But as I say, sometimes it means transferring land use rights from an individual's name into the company name, which is where it would normally be. I don't think there's any prohibition against it. It's more the time it takes and administrative procedures and dealing with the bureaucracy. And do you want fast track or do you want slow track?
Is there something called fast track in Vietnam?
I think so. I haven't experienced it personally, but.
What about enforceability of contractual agreement here in Vietnam? What's your personal experience with that?
So that is an issue. You want to take a more practical approach rather than a legalistic approach. What private equity funds will normally do, the managers will normally do in a contract, you put in an arbitration clause where you'd prefer to take it to either VAC, are you familiar with the Vietnam International Arbitration Committee, Council, or SIAC in Singapore. And I've just experienced a VAC process that started off rather slowly, but with the change in the chairman has accelerated quite fast. And during my experience there, I've seen that it can be quite effective. So I think arbitration would be the way to go to get enforceability. I understand there's also the Judgment Enforcement Agency. Are you familiar with them? Yeah. That can help on enforcing the judgment.
Foreign arbitral awards.
Yeah.
But you don't want to go to court.
Obviously not.
Obviously, good. I'm glad. I'm glad you're not going to ask me the question.
I understand that there are some problems in terms of protecting investors to select which exit method they would like to be and build it into the contract. Is that right?
It would be difficult to enforce a putback, for example, which would be more common, in other jurisdictions. But again, coming back, you want to be more practical, and you may not be able to rely on enforceability of the contract.
What about valuation of consideration?
Okay, well, the valuation cycle of private equity is not too dissimilar from the valuation of public equity. Generally, when a manager is valuing a company, they'll value it at the public multiple with an illiquidity discount. Generally speaking, everyone looks at the world a little bit differently. So, the cycle has followed pretty much what the Vietnam equity market has gone like. And, those who have been investing over the past 9 months, I think should have very good returns, in this vintage, so to speak. and those who invested in 2000 and late 2006 and into 2007, it's going to be tough. So.
Well, yeah, I'd just add to that I think with businesses that are in a high growth phase, there's also a tendency to look to business valuation and discounted cash flow methods of valuation rather than just relying on multiples, on comparables. But of course, comparables are also used in that methodology as well as a benchmark, as a guidance.
I understand that the Ministry of Finance has issued a roadmap in terms of commitment for the International Federation of Accountants, and for implementation of international financial reporting standards in Vietnam, but that's not going to be completed by 2020. So what's happening now and what happened in the past in terms of evaluating the target companies that you buy in?
Well, of course, most companies report under Vietnamese accounting standards, which are those that there are quite similar to international financial reporting standards, with the exception of treatment of fixed assets and fair value, because there's no revaluation of assets in Vietnam.
What about the double accounting system in Vietnam that a lot of the private companies are using?
Well, of course, we look at one set of books and we look at I mean, we have to look at the real accounts of the company, and this is sometimes a challenge when we take on new clients for auditing. But I think the long-term goal of Ministry of Finance is that Vietnamese accounting standards will conform to international financial reporting standards, IFRS, and also financial statements. But until you've got enough, it's a question of enough trained accountants and auditors, and also company management and financial managers and executives in companies that are familiar with IFRS.
So Nicky, which sets of books do you look at when you buy into a company?
Well, generally, we rely on the auditors. And from what I understand is, sometimes there are up to 3 sets, and sometimes they're given access to all. And, if they've done the due diligence well, they should, offer the fund manager a pretty comprehensive view.
Let's talk a bit about human resources in this particular industry, both for the target companies that you're buying as well as the professional in the private equity investment sector. Would you say a challenge there?
Yeah, this is, for me has been my greatest challenge working in Vietnam as, an international investment professional. And I see the issues both on the fund manager side as well as the management teams at the target side. And let me start with the management teams at the target side. What I see coming into Vietnam is there's not much of a middle management. At least middle management doesn't have kind of that level of authority that you have in other more developed markets. So that's quite challenging. It's almost like the chairman, who is normally still the CEO, has a direct report, into the rest of the company. It's a very interesting kind of structure, that vacuum of a middle management team. And as a fund manager trying to get data and working with these management teams, it's very hard because they have no decision power and sometimes limited access to things in the company. So that's particularly a challenge. So you have to deal specifically with the chairman and CEO, and he's obviously very busy. So that whole middle management issue is something that will need to get addressed over time. We are seeing some companies develop strong ones, some of the larger listed companies. And on the fund manager side, private equity is a new investment class. The country's, basically just, over the last 15 years or so, transferred from a totally different system. And, the universities, etc. here, just people don't have that level of experience in private equity investing. And it's all about discipline, ultimately, because, again, that's what the final investors want. is discipline. They want discipline in monitoring and reporting, and
Well, yeah. I mean, I agree with you, but I'd also say it's, we get a lot of mid-management professionals that are, getting qualified and learning their technical skills, which they do very, very well. But the problem is you can't teach experience. You've got to experience these situations for yourself over time before you can get to a certain level and feel comfortable and knowing really what to look for and where to go for information. And it's very difficult to teach that.
Yeah, it takes a lot of time.
You learn it over time.
So, for example, I've been in Vietnam about 3.5 years, and I'm now feeling the effect of the first few professionals I started to train that are now kicking in. So that's the kind of commitment and time frame it takes.
So there are no other solutions than just being very patient and training people and waiting?
Yeah.
What about the investee companies, the target companies that you're buying? Do you have a solution to sort of build up their human resources as well?
I think that there are limits of how much a financial investor can provide for a company. Ideally it's not too much, so the investment kind of takes care of itself, because it could be a black hole if you go in there and have to do everything with the company. I've worked on some venture capital investments where you can really get sucked in, and PE in Vietnam reminds me of some of that, where you have to watch for how much you're going to how close your relationship's going to be. But there are people out there like Mekong Capital in particular that have really developed a system. I think they've done fantastically. It's taken them a long time, a very bumpy road, but their system's starting to kick in, where they have deal partners working alongside their investors.
And they go in with a hands-on approach,
yeah.
And they add value to the company, and therefore they exit at very, very good multiples and returns.
So which boxes do you have to tick when you select a company to invest in here in Vietnam? Is management something that you need to tick as well?
Just from my perspective, it's basically the same things all over the world, what you're looking for. About 90% of the investment decision would be about management. Now, what is it about management? What's the science of evaluating management teams? Well, one thing is you want to make sure that you're aligned, that management has some, so to speak, skin in the game, that they're invested in the company or have exposure to this or benefit from the success of the company. And that's something that's kind of lacking in Vietnam, which, we're seeing slow improvements there. But management. Then one I like to see, again, is coming from that more Anglo-Saxon approach, is what I call pen to paper. I like to see management teams not just talk, but like to see reporting processes, documentation, discipline. I really like to see discipline. If the management team is out drinking beer during lunch, I most likely would not be interested in an investment like that. Obviously we look at the sector. Obviously,
that limits your choices.
There are a lot of deals are done through beer and karaoke here in Vietnam, right? Especially those that has relationship with the government.
Yeah, well, I hope that it's not the middle management team having beer every day, but there is a general kind of lack of discipline here, say compared to other countries, which I think will firm up over time.
So how do you define a strong management team in Vietnam in comparison to other markets that you have experience with? Is there any differences at all, or is it the same?
Well, if they're a strong management team, they should be the same, right? The problem is getting a lot of them from where they are today to the same, where we want them to actually be. And again, that, as we've said, I think it comes down to education, it comes down to training, and it comes down to a willingness to buy into the principles of corporate governance and transparency.
But generally, the standard of management of Vietnamese companies in comparison to other markets, would it be fairly the same or a bit
I would say very, very low.
If you're talking about emerging markets, it's going to be pretty well the same. But if you're talking about comparing Vietnam to, to Singapore or to Hong Kong or even Indonesia, it's going to be quite a lot lower.
And you can just see it by the number of expats in Vietnam at companies, including Vietnamese companies. I mean, you know, just the other day I was on a Vietnam Airlines flight and sitting next to a pilot who was telling me that, you know, something like 80% of Vietnam Airlines pilots are expats, you know. And it's just kind of the nascent stage of the country, having been isolated for so long, you know, and this will shift over a couple of generations.
So is it difficult for you to raise funds for Vietnam?
It's very challenging at the moment raising money for both listed and unlisted. We had a little bit of success this year in the listed market space, mainly by savvy investors, because it's very tough to come in kind of at the bottom of a market. As you can see with the patterns, most of the money came in when, you know, the valuations were quite high, but the real smart money is starting to come back. And we work with, you know, a lot of family offices and professional investors who are now getting invested. In the public markets, it's very challenging. There's been very little money raised in the past 18 months. I only know of, you know, one fund, I think it's the VI Group, that raised any money at all. And then there's been some money that's been raised in the clean tech space, where Dragon raised a clean tech, you know, you're familiar with? I think they call it Clean Development Mechanism. And then Indochina got a commitment from the US government for what we call renewable resources. So in kind of, you know, those, in that space, it's quite easy to raise. But outside that, it's, like I said earlier, we're down 75% from the top of the cycle.
But there are a couple of fund managers or funds that have gone out and raised new money in the last 18 months for Vietnam, quite successfully. But they've managed to go back to their original investors, and because they've been quite successful, they've managed to get repeats or additional funding from those investors. But generally speaking, particularly for the larger funds, it's been very, very difficult. I agree with you.